His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I am your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. Today we are going back to a favorite topic, a familiar topic, and we'll be talking not only about the history, but the history of the history, with today's very special and returning, there's a pun in that, guest.
I'm Bill Bleyer. I'm a retired Newsday reporter who is still a freelance writer for Newsday and magazines. I'm also a historian and author, having written 5 published books, and my 6th book on the Steamboat Lexington disaster will be out May 1st.
Right, so that's a little preview. We're going to have you back on, hopefully in time for that. So thank you. And we talked to you previously, so welcome back.
Thank you.
We talked about your life story and your work. I guess let me start off. When do you remember in your career, your life, first hearing about the Culper Spy Ring story?
Probably in Newsday somewhere. I started in 1981. Somewhere probably in the 80s, it would have come into sort of seeped into my consciousness, because I covered Oyster Bay as when I got hired by Newsday. I had also been the editor of the Oyster Bay Guardian, so I'm sure it was sort of out there, because I had done stories about Raynham Hall, and it was out there, but I never really researched it much. It was my first time I really began to pay specific attention, because I didn't do the Revolutionary War coverage of the famous Long Island Our Story series that Newsday did in the 90s for a year. So I think the first time I actually paid attention and began to look into it is when Brian Kilmeade put out his book. He spoke at Sewanee Yacht Club, and I covered that for Newsday. So I read his book and then began to sort of pay attention to the spy ring.
And what year did his book come out, The Secret Six?
2016. Well, that was the paperback, 2016.
Okay. And then so when Turn Washington Spies hit the airwaves, were you on board with that? Were you watching that as it was running?
Yeah, well, actually, my experience with Turn was kind of fun, because Vern Gay, the Newsday TV critic, was going to do a review and story about it. And then somebody said, well, I guess Howie Schneider, who was the editor and a history buff, said, well, let's have Bill do a companion sidebar story about the historical accuracy of Turn. So Vern sent me the first 2 episodes, preview copies from AMC, and I was sort of horrified.
Oh, really? Okay.
It might have been. I didn't even. He loved it. He thought it was great drama. He said even if the history's bad, I thought it was bad drama and bad history, because
okay.
I turned it on, and this is supposed to be about the spy ring. They didn't even broach the subject of spying for the first 45 minutes of the first episode. It was like it was Peyton Place. It was this non-existent romance between Abraham Woodhull and Anna Strong, and life in their version of Setauket for 45 minutes, and then they show a skirmish in New Jersey involving Benjamin Talmadge as a cavalryman. And the conversation is, well, the British knew what we were doing. They have a good spy operation. We need to start one. And that's the first mention of spying in this in this series about spying. And then they just went on, and, fellow historians and I have literally compiled a list of all the factual inaccuracies in Turn, which is sort of like a parlor game for us.
Yeah, and just from my experience talking to people, the more people know about the real history is in inverse proportion to their opinion of the show. I just like the sheer audacity that there was a 18th century drama set on Long Island that made it to actual air, that it exists at all.
Yeah, and I wouldn't have written my Culper Spy book without it, because my editor at the History Press came to me and said, Turn is back on Netflix, and the reruns are very popular. Can you come up with a Culper Spy book? Because we'd like to have that as one of our titles. And initially I said no, because I said it's been done by Kilmeade and much better by other authors. And, what is there to say? And then Steve Israel, the former congressman, was over at LIU running a think tank and invited me for coffee and said, we're trying to promote Long Island history, and particularly the George Washington spy trail that the state had created, when term was on the first time. And I said to him, I said, I don't, what would I say? It's been done. And then I'm driving away, literally driving away from having coffee with Steve, and the idea popped in my head. I said, well, if I did the history of the spy ring and then did a guidebook and history of all the Long Island Revolutionary War sites, that would be something different and interesting. And I called my editor while I'm driving home, and he said, great, because we want a Culper book. So that was the original idea. It was recap the Culper Spy Ring, and then the second half of the book would be site by site, any Long Island historical site that had a Revolutionary War connection. And the second half turned out as I planned. The first half turned out very different because I get into the research and I'm reading everything I can find that's published about the spy ring. And I'm talking to local historians. I'm reading the letters, and I keep finding all these conflicts, and I keep finding things that don't make sense, like Anna Strong's clothesline story. So I kept going back to my two main sources, which is Claire Belligeau, the historian at Raynham Hall, which was the home of the chief spy in the city, Robert Townsend, and Beverly Tyler, the historian for the Three Village Historical Society in Setauket. And I'd say, okay, Brian Kilmeade says this, what do you think? And I would tape it so I could basically compare it to what I had from in the published sources. And then I had this like brainstorm. I said, wait a minute, if there's so much misinformation and anecdotes that are made up and, flat out inventions, I should deal with that. So it turned out to be, rather than every other author has done their version of the spy ring and they say what happened, Brian Kilmeade's is the most fantastical, which isn't even footnoted. But so I decided, I said, rather than just picking my version, let's pick through all the versions, let the people that I know what they're talking about comment on it, and do an analytical history where I actually go through all the whole story and pick it apart, say what people say, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. So I ended up, even though I backed into it, it's the only analytical history of the spy ring that actually looks at what everybody else says and says, okay, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah, no, it's a great synthesis because you do go through and cite and sort of put them in juxtaposition to each other. So I guess as a general question, as you were reading through everyone from, Benjamin Franklin Thompson through Pennypacker through Rose, how did you evaluate what they were saying? Or were you trying to stay neutral, or were you looking for places where you could not pit them against each other, but, highlight against each other what they're each saying? How did you decide which people to accent when?
Well, I basically approached that as a journalist, and even though now I'm sort of a hybrid journalist / historian author, that same sensibility worked very well for me because I'm trained to gather a lot of information and pick through it. I would do that every day writing a Newsday story. You talk to different people and say what they say, and you would sort of say, okay, this makes sense, that doesn't make sense. And even my prime sources, Claire Belligeau and Bev Tyler would often disagree with each other. Sometimes all three of us would disagree, but I would put my analysis in the book. So I would lay it all out there for the readers, and I can say, so-and-so says this, so-and-so says that, and then my take is X, and then people are free to agree with me, disagree with me, and they have. It's fine. It's healthy.
So to recap the history of it, the basics: Long Island, after the Battle of Brooklyn or the Battle of Long Island, the Patriot forces had to evacuate, so Long Island became British territory. In reality, were occupied by the British forces during the war. So the Culper Spy Ring grew out of George Washington's attempts to build an intelligence network, right? Which really hadn't been done before, or was changing the way it had been done in the past.
Yeah, I mean, he was basically surprised multiple times in the summer of 1776. He knew the British were coming to try to capture New York. He didn't know when, how. So when they came in, the timing was a surprise. The fact they landed on Staten Island to organize was a surprise. The movement to Brooklyn was a surprise. Even then, Washington wasn't sure if that was the real attack. He thought that might be a feint to cover, a direct assault on Manhattan. The plan of the actual attack, with the bulk of the British Army went east through Jamaica Pass and rolled up the whole first American line, was a surprise. So, luckily, thanks to weather and British caution by the commander, he got his whole army back across the river intact in the fog to Manhattan. And one of the first things he did was create an intelligence network, because he'd been flummoxed there. He almost lost his life in the Braddock campaign across the Alleghenies in the French and Indian War, because the British marched off not knowing what the French and Indian allies were all about. So he tasks Colonel Thomas Knowlton to form a special unit of young bright officers to gather intelligence, and the most notable of those was Nathan Hale, which was a failure. Knowlton couldn't try again because he's killed in battles in northern Manhattan, and then Washington picks Talmadge to be the liaison with a New York businessman who turns out to be a terrible intelligence gatherer. But eventually it all coalesces after a couple of other failed attempts around Talmadge, and Talmadge basically creates the Culper Spy Ring.
Right, and he was a Setauket boy, so a lot of it was through his personal contacts, people he trusted or knew from growing up there.
Right.
And in terms of the historical record, now that you've probably read more of it than most people, big picture question, how effective in the end do you think the Culper Spy Ring, the information they passed on to Washington?
They were very valuable. Everybody who's written about the spy ring credits them to be valuable. And the weird exception is George Washington, who early in the war is praising them in the spy letters, saying that their intelligence is very valuable and I'm getting great information. He did complain throughout the war about how long it took to get him information, because the fact that it's going from Manhattan across the East River, 55 miles east to Setauket, across the Sound to Connecticut, and then west to wherever he was in north of New York or even in New Jersey. Initially, it took 3 weeks to get a message one way. And then, the Culpers fine-tuned the operation, got it down to 7 to 10 days. They tried various other ways to go north from Manhattan, through New Jersey, up through Port Washington. It never worked because they never had the right people in the right place. So they kept with Setauket because, as you said, they were all friends, relatives. They trusted each other, and it worked. But Washington complained a lot throughout the war, saying it's great information, but by the time I get it, I've either heard it often from other people already, or it's too late to act on it. But Washington's praising it by the end of the war, because the war had moved south, and because Benedict Arnold had flipped sides and was now a British general hunting for spies in New York City, forcing Robert Townsend to leave for 9 months. The intelligence coming from the Culpers kind of dried up. So at the end of the war, like Washington complained when he got a last invoice from Talmadge to pay the expenses of the spy people, he complained that it always took too long, and they didn't get, they didn't give me enough information, and said, their messages weren't frequent, which is kind of an odd comment, because if you look at the spy letters, he's getting a report about once a week, and sometimes even more frequently. But all the historians going back to Pennypacker, everybody since says they were very valuable. And a couple of examples is from the very first letter from whaleboat captain Caleb Brewster, who's actually sort of jump-starting the whole operation before there is an operation, because he writes an unsolicited letter to Washington offering to gather intelligence on the island where he goes, because he's fearless. And out on the Sound, he alerts Washington for a British plan to capture Newport, Rhode Island. So it allows Washington to warn the garrison, reinforce the garrison. The British pick up on that and call off the attack. So that's right off the bat, he saves Newport from probable capture from the British. There's a whole lot of examples. Probably the most important one is late in the war. Townsend writes a letter to Washington saying that the British have acquired a stock of printing paper, which is the same paper that the Continental Congress uses to print continental currency. And the British have been trying to counterfeit the colonial currency throughout the war to deflate the value, so they couldn't afford to buy supplies in Europe. And it never worked because the paper was always the wrong paper, and merchants and government officials could spot it. But Townsend says they've got the same paper now that the Continental Congress is using, so the counterfeit scheme could actually work. So Washington immediately writes Congress, pointing out the danger. Congress, being Congress, dithers for 3 months and then finally withdraws all the currency and prints new paper money.
And you mentioned the letter, so I just want to dive a little into the research.
I should add
Sure,
one other thing. So if Washington becomes the outlier on the negative side, the outlier on the positive side is Brian Kilmeade, who flat out in his book says that the Culper Spy Ring, and he calls it the Secret Six because he says there's only 6 members of the spy ring, when at least 12 to 14 have been positively identified as being players. And in his 6, Kilmeade leaves out Caleb Brewster and Austin Rowe, the courier riding his horse down Long Island. So he never explains in the book how a spy ring could operate without getting the information from one person to the other. But he basically says in the book that the Culper Spy Ring won the revolution single-handedly, not that they helped Washington and the Continental Army. He says the spy ring saved the American Revolution, won the revolution for the Americans, which every other historian thinks is like major hyperbole.
Right. And if how could you leave out Caleb Brewster anyway? Just from a narrative standpoint, that's a character that needs to be in any history.
Yeah, he needs to be his own book.
Exactly. So there are, from when I read, 193 existing letters or evidence of this correspondence.
Now it's 194, actually.
Oh, they found another one? Okay, great.
They found one. They found one in the Long Island Museum in 2020 the summer when they were closed because of COVID. They decided to use that time to sort of clean out and organize their archives in the basement. They found a notebook from 1951 that acknowledged a donation of a Culper Spy letter, which nobody at the museum knew anything about. So they tracked the letter down in a box on a top shelf in storage and found, in fact, a Culper letter, which they then verified was a Culper letter, and then had it conserved. And now they occasionally put it on display. So that's 194.
Oh, that's great. And some of these have been transcribed, so they're not necessarily the original, letter that Brewster would have carried across, but the content has been copied over.
Yeah, there are some originals. There are a lot of copies. There are a lot of when they got into code, the original coded ones may have been lost, but the transcribed ones in plain English exist. Most of them are in the Library of Congress, but they're all over the place.
Yeah, and so it's interesting because we talk about drama and turn, but reading the letters, it's amazing to me the personalities that come through, and Woodhull complaining about being paid and the dangers and being nervous. So I mean, from what you've read, what of the people came across to you through the letters?
Well, my favorite character is Caleb Brewster, who's refuses when the other players adopt the first level of code security by giving themselves code names. So Talmadge becomes John Bolton, and Abraham Woodhull becomes Culper Sr. Caleb Brewster is fearless and doesn't want to bother. He wants the British to know who he is. He's basically leaving his calling card. He keeps going to visit Long Island, even though it's enemy territory, to gather information and visit friends. He's fighting with the British whaleboat crews and the Tory whaleboat crews on the Sound. Has these running gun battles and basically dares the British to capture them, which they try repeatedly. So he wants them to know who he is, and they know that, and he couldn't care less. So he's a fascinating character. Townsend is this kind of depressive recluse. Interesting. Never talked ever about his spy work during or after the war. When his nephew pressed him about it, he wouldn't talk about it. And Woodhull is kind of this interesting nervous Nelly, like constantly writing about his fear of being unmasked and captured, and threatening to flee to Connecticut, but he sticks with it. So I give him credit. I mean, it was this. He knew from Nathan Hale and other examples that if they were caught, they'd end up on the gallows. So I mean, I credit them all for the courage to do this.
Now, you talked about the code, and they also had numbers for different people and places. I guess, and we're talking about new discoveries being made, so there's always someone new being added to the roster. So what's the danger of looking at the letters as the sole source of who's in the ring? Like that if they're not in the letter, then that's sort of the only characters, like the six, however he came up with six. Kilmeade said these are the six in the ring. So how did you look at defining who was in the Culper Spy Ring?
Well, I mean, it's basically the letters are it. So, I mean, that's all there is. I mean, Pennypacker started with the letters, and then there's tangential things like Robert Townsend, as the son of a merchant and his father's merchant agent in the city, kept extremely detailed records of every penny that he came in or that he spent on anything, which helps because we know that he subscribed to James Rivington's Tory paper, that we know he bought reams of paper from Rivington's mercantile shop, which he then used to write spy letters. So there's tangential things like that, but there's really not a lot of documentary evidence. Talmadge wrote a unpublished autobiography for his children, and in it there's 2 sentences about the spy ring. Woodhull never wrote about it. Townsend never wrote about it, never talked about it. Washington never talked about it. So all you have is basically the spy letters, and you have Townsend's records, and that's sort of really it. But they make it pretty clear, who's in it. So we know who the spies were. We know who the couriers were. We know people that supported the spy ring, like Anna Strong, but we're not really spies. So it's pretty clear, and the mistakes, and there are a multitude of them, are people not doing their homework, basically. The most popular one that's out there now, thanks to Turn and Kilmeade, and going back to Morton Pennypacker, is this whole idea of Agent 55, 355, which there is no evidence to support whatsoever.
Right, and from what I read, so 355 was just the code number for the word lady, and so there's one letter where he says I'm going to meet with a 355 or something like that.
Yeah, he says with the help of a 355, which is code for woman in general, I expect to outwit the British, and that's it. So we know he had a female acquaintance, and I think it's Anna Strong. So does a few other people, but there's disagreement on even who the friend was. We know that she would ride into the city with him, like if he was taking farm produce to New York as a cover for getting information. So, she was helping. There's family connections between the Strongs and Woodhull. It's all. If you go with the letters, the story is very clear, and that's what I did. In the experts I trust, are going back to the letters which they've read and analyzed. And where people get in trouble is they take the letters and they start to interpolate and expand on the letters, and then they invent characters, they invent things that never happened. They create this Agent 355 who didn't exist, because there's only one reference in all 194 letters to any woman whatsoever. And then from that, people have turned that person mentioned once into a secret agent. They didn't even use that term agent much in that era. Then they turned that Agent 355 into a socialite in the city who goes to the British spy master John Andre's parties to gather information. Then they turn her into the mistress of Robert Townsend in the city, and have a baby, an illegitimate child with Townsend. And then Agent 355 supposedly ends up on a British prison hulk in the East River. And it's all totally made up. There is nothing to back it up.
What else would you point out, or one or two other examples? What are the biggest misconceptions that you saw that leaked into the record or the common tellings of it?
The one anecdote or episode of the Spy Ring that most people have heard of, thanks to Turn and Pennypacker, is Anna Strong's clothesline. And for those who are not familiar with it, she presumably, reportedly, would put a white petticoat on her clothesline on the shore in Setauket of her house, actually her servants' quarters, and that white petticoat would signal Abraham Woodhull, who lived across the bay, that Caleb Brewster had arrived to pick up or drop off letters, going one way or the other for the spy ring. Then she would put 1 to 6 black handkerchiefs next to it, indicating where in those complex of bays around Setauket and Port Jefferson Caleb Brewster would be waiting. So there's no evidence whatsoever to support that. It showed up in Pennypacker. He writes about it. A Strong descendant, Kate Strong, writes a book of family history back in, I guess it was the 50s, and says it's true, and she knows it's true because of family documents and documents that Morton Pennypacker showed her. But all that stuff is in the East Hampton Library, and no historian who's gone through all this has ever found anything to back up the story. And it could have happened. I mean, it's a plausible way to communicate, but it's not necessarily even required, because when they met, they could say, okay, we'll meet you here again in 2 weeks. Occasionally in the letters, they even, set meeting dates and times. Plus, she could have walked or ridden or sent a servant half mile around the shoreline to Woodhull's house and say, okay, Caleb Brewster's waiting for you, in this cove in Setauket. So it could have, it's a plausible way to communicate and be a clever way to communicate, but there's no proof it happened. And further, the best debunking of all is one of the people that we know was in the spy ring was actually spying was Phillips Rowe, who lived in Port Jefferson. And that Phillips Rowe house has been turned, which was called Drowned Meadow Cottage, has now actually been turned into a museum house. And their curator, Mark Steinberg, has done a lot of great research. I know you had him on recently.
Yeah.
And what he determined was, going through the records, that Anna Strong, the Strongs were like the wealthiest people in the Setauket area. They were built in a big colonial manor. During the war, Mark determined from his research, Anna Strong wasn't even living in Setauket. They were living in the other side of Port Jefferson Harbor in what's now Belterre. That makes the whole clothesline story geographically impossible. So that's the best debunking of all, that there was no clothesline involved in this.
Yeah, and just to build off of that, because I re-listened to Mark's just to get my head back into the Culper story, in terms of how the record gets corrected. And maybe this, if you think back to journalism days, when there's a big headline and then the story gets updated on page 20 or something later. And the other thing Mark uncovered was that Silas Strong did not flee to Connecticut, that he was actually in the area during
Right.
most of the Revolution. So do you see those stories getting into how good did you see the histories that you read? Were they updating with new information, or do you think these old stories will just continue to be repeated without any consideration of new discoveries?
It depends. The problem is a lot of these books are been out a while, and the publishers are not going to update them. Like, what was considered the best and most accurate book. I think mine is more accurate now, but Alex Rose was like the Bible when he put out his book a while back, and that was actually the basis for Turn. And they hired him as a historical consultant, and then ignored most of what he told him, because I had interviewed him when I did the story for Newsday about Turn, and he said basically, they hire you, they buy the rights. You sit off in the corner, you can raise objections, and sometimes they listen to you, and sometimes they don't. So you have things like the first introduced Anna Strong as serving booze, rum drinks to people in a tavern in Setauket, and she's the richest sort of hierarchy, top of the hierarchy in that whole region. It's like Martha Washington, serving drinks in Mount Vernon.
Right,
it's
right.
ridiculous. But the stuff is rarely updated. The one that really, other than Kilmeade, is a whole class by himself. But other than that, the thing that really tickled me was a former CIA case officer or analyst wrote about not only repeated that the clothesline story was real, he changed it so it wasn't the clothesline was signaling Woodhull across the bay. It was signaling Talmadge in Connecticut, which ignores the curvature of the earth, because you can only see 6 miles before things drop below the horizon. Ignores the giant sand dunes along the entrance to Port Jefferson Harbor, which block the view of Port Jefferson, and ignores the fact that Setauket Peninsula is a rising big sand glacial hill covered with trees. So the only way that Talmadge could actually have seen the clothesline, if it existed, was through a spy satellite. So I wrote a summary of my book for the Journal of the American Revolution, which is the most respected online revolutionary history site. And the CIA guy saw my article and wrote in the comments saying, thanks for correcting me. But, his book has been out, for a while, and none of the stuff gets updated generally.
Yeah. Just to pivot to the book too, which I'll recommend, and I always like when there's so much visual material. So you've got images, maps, you've got photographs, and what I wanted to ask you about it always surprises me how much of the physical remains there are. We think of Long Island as overdeveloped, but there's a lot of places, or at least remnants of places, related to this story. What are some of your comments or experiences going to actual places that these spies were operating in, or what remained, that houses and things like that?
Well, I mean, the most prominent is Raynham Hall, which was the Townsend family house, which is also the subject of a lot of these, made up anecdotes. But Townsend didn't do any spying from Raynham Hall, but that's the family house, and they tell the story there. But Raynham Hall for years, and it's still on the historical marker and out in front, was that the whole Benedict Arnold treason plot was exposed because of Raynham Hall, because John Andre was staying there, and Robert's younger sister Sally overhears Andre talking to Colonel Simcoe, the head of the Queen's Rangers, about this plot for Arnold to switch sides and turn over West Point to the British. And she supposedly writes a letter to her brother in the city, who alerts Talmadge, and that's how they capture Andre and expose the plot. And this is repeated in a lot of books. And the problem with that is Andre did stay at Raynham Hall. He wrote letters from Raynham Hall, so we know that he was there. We know when he was there because of the letters, which are dated. And it's a full year before the whole Arnold thing starts to evolve. So it's nonsense. It's very hard to correct it because you're fighting, like Turn, which is, mass market, popular show. And that's what most people think is the real story of the spy ring.
So but to go back to physical places, some I've seen, some I haven't. What would you, I guess, let me ask it this way. What would you recommend, or what was you think is an undiscovered, or, could use some visitation that people should go check out this evidence of Revolutionary War Long Island that they can still see?
Well, the newest and best place to go, and definitely undiscovered, unvisited, is Phillips Row House in Port Jeff. Because it used to only be open like around Christmas, and then it'd be decorated for Christmas, and the Revolutionary War stuff was like one little exhibit in one room. But now that they decided to go the full history route and open it regularly, you can learn a lot there. Setauket is ground zero. Bev Tyler for the Three Village Historical Society does walking tours, which are extremely informative. And there's also a commercial company out there that does tours. So you can go to Patriot Rock, where they and the churches that were involved in the American raid across the Sound. It became known as the Battle of Setauket. There's a lot of history there. The Abraham Woodhull's house unfortunately burned down, but you can go to the cemetery where he's buried. So, I mean, you can spend a whole day in and around Setauket.
Okay. The other thing I want to mention, sometime I'll do a full episode on it, but George Washington's Long Island tour in 1790, where he visited a lot of it almost maps to a lot of known Culper Spy people. What's your opinion? And so I guess the debate is why did he come out here, or was there a deeper meaning to why he came out here? What's your thoughts on Washington's tour?
That tour would be worth a full discussion. That's another one of these things where there's limited real evidence, and people have just made these giant leaps of faith, which I think are ridiculous. And some historians that I respect, like Beverly Tyler, think that Washington came in 1790 for 5 days to Long Island, primarily to thank the Culper Spy Ring. And I strongly disagree for a bunch of reasons. Washington kept a very detailed private diary of the 5-day trip, where he went, where he ate, where they watered the horses, where he slept. Never mentions the Culper Spy Ring. The people that say he did it said, okay, the first night or the first day, second day, I guess, because first night was in Jamaica. He gets out to the Amityville area and eats a meal at the home of a minor courier player in the spy ring, who I'm sure Washington had no idea was involved. You also have to realize that early in the spy ring, when Abraham Woodhull gets involved, Washington tells Talmadge to bring Woodhull to headquarters north of New York because he wants to meet him and plan strategy. And Woodhull and Talmadge talk him out of it and saying, we know there are British spies in and around your headquarters. And if I come there, the whole spy ring could be unraveled. So Washington realizes that's good advice and says, I don't want to know who anybody is other than Talmadge. And as far as we know, he never, even after the war, never made any effort or wanted to know who these people were. So in the diary, he mentions everything where he's staying, and he stays the middle night in Setauket at Austin Rowe's Tavern. So Austin Rowe is the chief courier back and forth for the spy ring. So you'd say, okay, well, it's pretty obvious that he stayed there and knew who Rowe was, except in the diary, where it's only writing for himself, not meant for publication or anybody but his own use, doesn't mention any of the spy rings. And when he stays at Rowe Tavern, he doesn't even mention Austin Rowe by name. He says it's a nice place, the food was good, the people were nice. There's no indication that Rowe was even there, and we do know for a fact that Rowe had business interests down in Patchogue, which is where Washington stayed the previous night, and he learns that Washington is going to stay at his tavern and is already on the road towards Setauket, so he gets on a horse and gallops north, and here's a guy that's been galloping back and forth, 55 miles each way without incident throughout the war, but he gets thrown from his horse and breaks his leg. And there's no follow-up, so we don't know if he got patched up and made it to the tavern or just went back to Patchogue and never even got to the tavern. But why wouldn't Washington say, I met Austin Rowe, and he's runs a good operation, or I got to chat with Austin Rowe and thank him for his service in the Culper Spy Ring? Doesn't mention Rowe at all, or the spy ring. The other thing you have to put in historical context is Washington, as president, every year in the spring when Congress was not in session and the government was not doing much, would take a tour of someplace around the country. And there's actually a whole book just on that just came out. And it all starts with Alexander Hamilton, who's his Secretary of the Treasury, making the suggestion that when Congress is quiet, why don't you go out, show the flag, meet your constituents. So in 1789, he does an extensive trip up through New England and does that with a lot of speeches and parades and dinners, all of which Washington hates. So he's basically doing the same thing on Long Island, except because he hated all the fanfare the year before, it's pretty much unannounced. He basically just shows up and makes the travel arrangements as he goes. So he's meeting people, but they're like farmers on their fields and things.
Right.
But there's nothing formal, no speeches. And a lot of places, like in Huntington, when he shows up unannounced, they quickly throw together like a big celebration, which he wasn't particularly excited about. But no proof at all other than that he wanted to see the countryside. He's a farmer, so he in the diary is full of references to what the farmers were growing, what the soil conditions were like, what the topography is like. Not a word about the spy ring.
Yeah, he's pretty terse in general, so you have to tease out, or the danger is how much can you tease out of the very minimal descriptions he was leaving. But just as a bigger question, is there a piece of the Spy Ring story that you see is missing, or if you could fill in a gap somehow, what would you want to know?
Good question. I mean, we really know a lot, and when it goes back to Pennypacker's, pretty amazing research. It's just Pennypacker didn't stick with the facts. He was the first one to figure out how it worked, who was in it, proved that Townsend was Culper Jr. through handwriting analysis. I mean, the big mystery, the big thing is we know the 194 letters survived despite constant pressure from Woodhull and Townsend to Talmadge and Washington to destroy the letters after they were read, but they didn't. It would be great to have the full set. You could really get the full play-by-play. And I'm sure there's other people out there like Phillips Rowe who played at least the minor role that just haven't surfaced yet.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to keep you much longer. Anything I haven't asked you, or any other thoughts or items about the book or the research that you want to get across?
Well, I mean, the one thing that fascinated me is the whole spy game during the Revolution in America is like a battle of amateurs. Washington basically learns it, on the job. Talmadge learns it on the job. Andre, who is the chief aide to the different British commanders, learns it on the job. And the odd thing is, spycraft was a well-developed science in the European militaries. There's actually textbooks on how to do codes and all this stuff, and it all sort of never crossed the Atlantic, which is like the thing that really surprised me, because the British were very good at it. They had cryptologists, in the British military, and the whole British handling of the war is a blunder after blunder. And between that and our luck, we won. But it's like, why didn't somebody in London say, let's send one of these experts over to the colonies because we know they're doing spy codes and stuff. And Talmadge and Washington realize that, which is why they keep inventing more and more sophisticated codes. But it's all very elementary, even by the standards of that era. So they could have shut down the Culper Spy Ring probably in the first year of its operation if they had actually, thought about doing it properly.
Paid some more attention, right? Yeah, and I think when I spoke with Bev Tyler, like they knew it was going, at some point they knew it was going through Setauket. Like they had pretty good clues about the system.
Yeah, I mean, most of the people left in Setauket were Tories. A lot of them complained to Simcoe in particular that Woodhull was spying and helping the British. Phillips Rowe was identified by a Tory regimental commander as helping the Patriots from Port Jefferson. And they actually did raids. Bannister Tarleton and other people, cavalry officers, organized raids across the Sound. They captured some of the Culper couriers going back and forth along the Connecticut shore. So they actually captured some of the letters. In one raid, they actually captured Talmadge's horse and a spy letter in the saddlebag, but luckily it was in code and they couldn't break it. Which comes back to my point, is if the British had actually focused their expertise on the spy ring, they could have pretty much rolled it up probably in 1789.
Anything else you want to say, Jonas? We'll hopefully we'll be talking to you again when we get to your latest book on the Lexington steamboat disaster. But anything you're doing between now and then that we could let people know about?
Yeah, the Lexington will be out May 1st, and I'm starting to do lectures in mid-April. If people want to know where I'm speaking, and I have 10 different lectures, the Culper's one, and Lexington will be number 11. I have a Facebook page called Bill Bleyer History Lectures that they can go on, and I publicize all my speaking engagements there. The other thing is, if people want, this book is available every library on Long Island, every bookstore on Long Island, plus Amazon and places like that. But if some people who like to collect signed inscribed editions, they can email me at billbleyer@gmail.com to arrange to get one.
Great. You should sign them in invisible ink. It'd be a nice, nice gimmick. And thank you again to Bill. We will link in our show notes to further information about him, about his book, and about sites on Long Island related to the Culper Spy Ring history. We'll also have a link to a number of the people we've talked to about it. So if you want to know more, dive into who was Pennypacker, what does Bev Tyler really think, the Culper spy letters at the Stony Brook University Archives and Special Collections. We have a descendant of Kate Strong talking about the Strong family legacy on Strong's Neck. We also sat down with librarians at the East Hampton Public Library, just feet away from where Morton Pennypacker actually sat at his desk. So we've been following this topic for a while, and again, if you want to listen back to some of that history, that keeps evolving. Check out our show notes. That's at longislandhistoryproject.org. And we'd like to hear from you. If you have any comments or questions or suggestions, drop us a line, longislandhistoryproject@gmail.com. Always looking for more guests or topics. Let us know, what is it about Long Island history that you are passionate about. That does it for this episode. Our outro music is Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. And as always, thank you for listening.